Our marriage didn't end in anger or betrayal. It ended in emotional exhaustion. That was the sentence I repeated in my head the night I packed my clothes into 2 suitcases and left the house we once called a dream. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no dramatic goodbye. Just silence, the kind that grows slowly, unnoticed, until it fills every room. Emily and I met in college. We were young, hopeful, and convinced that love alone could carry us through anything. Back then, we talked for hours about everything and nothing. We laughed easily. We believed listening was effortless and understanding was automatic. We thought love meant never running out of words. But years passed and life arrived quietly, carrying responsibilities on its back. Jobs became demanding. Welcome to my channel. If you're watching this on Facebook, don't forget to follow the page. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you enjoyed the story, let me know in the comments below. You can also share your thoughts from the heart in the comments, so I can create more stories based on what you love. Thank you for your support. Bills replaced dreams on our kitchen table. Conversations turned into schedules, reminders, and unfinished sentences. Somewhere between promotions and disappointments, we stopped asking each other how we were really doing. I noticed it first in the mornings. We would sit across from each other, coffee growing cold, scrolling through our phones like strangers waiting for different buses. I wanted to speak, but I didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound heavy. Emily wanted to speak too, I'm sure, but she carried the same hesitation. We were both tired, not physically, but emotionally. Exhaustion has a strange way of disguising itself as patience. We told ourselves it was normal. This is adulthood, we said. This is marriage. We believed love was supposed to feel quiet after a while. So we ignored the small warnings, the sighs, the forced smiles, the way we avoided eye contact when hard topics appeared. At night, we slept inches apart, separated not by space, but by unspoken thoughts. I could feel her breathing, steady and familiar, yet unreachable. I wanted to pull her closer, but I didn't know if closeness was still welcome or just another obligation. Arguments didn't break us. What broke us was the effort it took to not argue. We became experts at swallowing words. We avoided conflict so well that we avoided honesty too. Every unresolved feeling stacked itself quietly inside us, layer after layer, until love felt heavy instead of warm. One evening, after a long day, Emily sat on the edge of the bed and said, "I'm tired." I asked, "Long day at work?" She nodded, but her eyes told a different story. That was the moment I realized her tiredness had nothing to do with work. It was the tiredness of explaining yourself and not being understood, of loving someone and still feeling alone. I wanted to fix it. I suggested vacations, therapy, date nights, new routines, solutions that sounded good but required energy we no longer had. Emotional exhaustion doesn't scream, it whispers, and by the time you hear it clearly, you're already empty. The hardest part wasn't the thought of separation. It was accepting that neither of us was the villain. We still cared. We still respected each other. But caring without connection feels like carrying a beautiful vase that's already cracked. You handle it gently, knowing one wrong move could shatter everything. The night before I left, we sat together on the living room floor, surrounded by memories, photos, old letters, souvenirs from trips we once believed defined us. We didn't cry much. Tears require energy too. Emily said, "I don't hate you." I replied, "I don't either." And in that moment, I understood something painful and honest. Love doesn't always end because it dies. Sometimes it ends because it's been carrying too much for too long. When I closed the door behind me, there was no dramatic soundtrack, no final argument. Just a quiet acknowledgement that staying would have required pretending, and leaving was the last honest thing we could do for each other. That was the beginning of our ending, not loud, not cruel, just unbearably tired. After I left, the world didn't collapse the way movies promise it will. No rainstorm followed me. No sudden clarity appeared. Life simply continued, and that somehow hurt more. I moved into a small apartment on the edge of the city. The walls were white, undecorated, and honest, nothing pretending to be a home yet. At night, the silence there felt different. It wasn't the shared silence I knew from my marriage. This one didn't wait for anyone else to speak. The first few days were strangely light. I cooked only for myself. I left shoes wherever I wanted. I slept diagonally across the bed. Freedom arrived quietly, almost politely, and for a moment I wondered if leaving had been the right decision all along. But emotional exhaustion doesn't disappear when the relationship ends. It follows you. Memories began showing up uninvited. While brushing my teeth, I remembered how Emily used to stand behind me, resting her chin on my shoulder, asking about my day. In grocery stores, I instinctively reached for things she liked, only to stop halfway down the aisle, confused about who I was buying them for now. We didn't stop talking immediately. Our messages were careful, respectful, and distant, like two people handling fragile glass through text. We discussed paperwork, mail, practical things. We avoided emotions the same way we always had. It was familiar, almost comforting, and deeply sad. One night, she called. There was a long pause before either of us spoke. I could hear her breathing on the other end, steady but heavy, like she was holding something back. I feel empty, she finally said. I closed my eyes. Not because I didn't want to hear it, but because I did. I know, I replied, and I meant it in the deepest way possible. She asked if I was okay. That question sat between us like a test neither of us wanted to fail. I wanted to say yes, to make it easier for her, but honesty felt more important now than comfort. I don't know yet, I said. That was the truth. The hardest part of emotional exhaustion is realizing how much of yourself you gave away without noticing. I had spent years trying to be understanding, calm, patient, reliable until I forgot how to be present. Emily had done the same. We weren't drained because we didn't love each other. We were drained because we tried to love each other correctly instead of honestly. People around us wanted explanations. Friends asked what happened. Family members searched for someone to blame. There was no simple answer that satisfied them. Saying we got tired sounded weak, almost irresponsible, as if marriage should survive anything if you just try hard enough. But trying endlessly without being seen is its own kind of loneliness. Some nights, guilt hit me without warning. I wondered if leaving was selfish. If staying a little longer might have fixed things. If emotional exhaustion was just another phase we should have pushed through. Then I remembered the way Emily's voice sounded toward the end, softer, cautious, like she was afraid of asking for too much. I remembered how carefully I chose my words, editing myself constantly to avoid tension. That wasn't partnership anymore. That was survival. Healing didn't feel empowering at first. It felt slow, awkward, directionless. I sat alone with feelings I had ignored for years, resentment I never expressed, sadness I minimized, needs I convinced myself were unreasonable. Without the marriage to distract me, everything came to the surface. Emily and I met once, weeks later, to exchange the last of our things. We sat across from each other at a cafe, two people who knew each other's coffee orders by heart but no longer knew each other's futures. She looked tired, but lighter somehow, like someone who had finally set down a heavy bag. "I've been sleeping better," she said quietly. I nodded. Me too. That honesty didn't hurt. It relieved us. There was affection in that meeting, but no pull to return. The exhaustion had burned that bridge gently, without flames, leaving only understanding behind. As we stood to leave, she hesitated. "I hope one day," she said, "we both feel full again." I watched her walk away, realizing something important. Endings born from emotional exhaustion don't come with hatred. They come with acceptance. And acceptance, while peaceful, carries its own grief. I walked back to my apartment alone, aware that this chapter wasn't about moving on yet. It was about learning how to sit with what was lost without rushing to replace it. Because when a marriage ends this way, healing isn't dramatic. It's quiet. And it had only just begun. The days that followed didn't feel like progress. They felt like standing still while the world moved forward without me. I learned quickly that healing from emotional exhaustion isn't about finding happiness again. It's about learning how to exist without constantly explaining yourself, without measuring your words, without carrying the weight of someone else's expectations on your chest. Mornings were the hardest. I woke up automatically at the same time I always had, reaching for a phone that no longer held messages from Emily. The habit of sharing my first thought of the day didn't disappear just because the marriage ended. Habits are loyal like that. They stay even when people don't. I started taking long walks through the city, not to clear my head, but to feel something move inside me again. The streets were full of life. People rushing to work, couples holding hands, strangers laughing at things I couldn't hear. Everyone seemed connected to something. I felt like an observer, present but detached. That detachment scared me. Emotional exhaustion leaves you numb before it leaves you broken. I wasn't devastated. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even deeply sad all the time. I was just empty. And emptiness doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly and convinces you this is who you are now. I tried distractions. Work filled my hours. Music filled the silence. Streaming shows filled the nights. But every distraction wore off eventually, leaving me alone with the same unanswered question: who am I without the marriage? For years, my identity had been tied to being a husband. Being reliable, being calm, being the one who didn't ask for much. I wore emotional restraint like a badge of honor. I thought that was maturity. Now I wondered if it was avoidance. I started therapy not because I felt broken, but because I didn't want to stay numb forever. Sitting across from a stranger, I found it harder to speak than I expected. Words felt unfamiliar, like tools I hadn't used properly in years. "What exhausted you the most?" the therapist asked. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. The answer wasn't Emily. It wasn't work. It wasn't marriage itself. It was the constant effort to be okay when I wasn't. I had spent years minimizing my needs because they felt inconvenient. I told myself other people had it worse. I convinced myself silence was strength. Over time, that silence turned inward and started draining me from the inside. Emily had done the same in her own way. That realization didn't bring relief. It brought responsibility. Healing meant admitting I played a role in my own emptiness. It meant accepting that love doesn't survive on good intentions alone. Some evenings, guilt returned unexpectedly. I replayed moments where I could have spoken up, where I could have asked harder questions, where I could have chosen discomfort over distance. Regret is persuasive. It tells you the past was fixable if only you had tried one more time. But emotional exhaustion doesn't work that way. By the time you recognize it, the damage has already settled deep. You don't leave because you stop loving. You leave because you no longer recognize yourself inside the relationship. I ran into Emily once by accident. It was at a bookstore we both used to love. For a brief second, time folded in on itself, and it felt like nothing had changed. She smiled, and I smiled back. It was natural. Easy. "How are you?" she asked. I paused. This time, I didn't default to "I'm fine." "I'm learning," I said. She nodded slowly. "Me too." We talked for a few minutes about books, work, small things. There was warmth there, but no longing. That surprised me. What remained between us wasn't desire or regret. It was respect. And strangely, that felt like enough. After she left, I stood alone in the aisle, realizing something important. Closure doesn't always come with final conversations or emotional speeches. Sometimes closure arrives quietly, disguised as peace. Loneliness still visited me, especially at night. But it was different now. It wasn't the lonely feeling of being unseen next to someone. It was the honest loneliness of being alone. And there's a difference. One drains you. The other teaches you. I began to listen to myself again. I noticed what I liked. What drained me. What made me feel present. I stopped apologizing for needing space. I stopped explaining my boundaries like they were flaws. Slowly, carefully, I started rebuilding from the inside out. Not to prepare for another relationship, but to make sure I never disappeared inside one again. Emotional exhaustion had taken my marriage, but it gave me clarity in return. Painful clarity, but honest. I learned that love requires energy, yes, but it also requires truth. And without truth, even the deepest love will eventually run out of breath. As weeks turned into months, I didn't feel healed. I felt awake. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough to keep going. Enough didn't mean happy. Enough didn't mean healed. Enough simply meant honest. I stopped rushing myself toward some imagined finish line where everything would suddenly make sense. Emotional exhaustion had taught me something important. When you force yourself to move faster than your heart can follow, you only end up tired again. This time, I chose slowness. Life began to rearrange itself in small, almost invisible ways. I changed my routines, not to reinvent myself, but to remove the pressure of pretending. I cooked meals without rushing. I sat with my thoughts instead of drowning them out. I let silence exist without trying to fix it. The quiet no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like space. There were still moments when memories surfaced without warning. A song in a coffee shop. A street we once walked together. A phrase Emily used to say when she was trying to be brave. Those moments didn't crush me anymore. They softened me. I understood now that remembering didn't mean wanting to return. It simply meant acknowledging that something real had existed, and real things leave marks. One afternoon, while cleaning out an old box, I found a letter Emily had written years ago. It wasn't dramatic or poetic. It was simple. She thanked me for being steady, for listening, for making her feel safe. I sat there for a long time, holding that letter. For the first time, I didn't read it as proof of what we lost. I read it as proof of what we gave. And that mattered. Emotional exhaustion doesn't erase love. It just signals that love has been asked to survive without nourishment for too long. I realized then that I didn't want to rewrite our ending. I wanted to understand it. We hadn't failed because we were careless. We hadn't failed because we didn't try. We failed because we didn't know how to rest emotionally while still staying connected. We mistook endurance for intimacy. We believed silence was safer than truth. That understanding brought peace, not the loud kind, but the steady kind that doesn't demand attention. Emily and I spoke one last time, intentionally this time. There were no logistics left, no shared responsibilities. Just two people choosing to acknowledge what had been. "I don't regret us," she said. Neither did I. We didn't promise friendship. We didn't promise distance either. We simply wished each other well without conditions. And that felt mature in a way our younger selves would have misunderstood. Walking away from that conversation, I felt something close to gratitude. Not for the pain, but for the clarity that followed it. In the months that came after, people occasionally entered my life, conversations, connections, possibilities. I didn't rush toward them. I didn't pull away either. I stayed present. I stayed honest. Most importantly, I stayed myself. I learned that emotional exhaustion isn't a weakness. It's a signal. It tells you where you abandoned yourself in the name of peace. It shows you the cost of being agreeable at the expense of being authentic. It teaches you that love cannot survive on patience alone. It needs expression, boundaries, and rest. Our marriage didn't end in anger or betrayal. It ended because two people who cared deeply were too tired to keep pretending they were okay. And that ending, as painful as it was, gave us something rare, the chance to begin again separately, without resentment. Some endings don't explode. They fade. And in that fading, they leave behind wisdom instead of ruins. Today, when I think of love, I don't imagine perfection or permanence. I imagine presence. I imagine two people willing to speak before silence grows heavy. I imagine choosing honesty even when it's uncomfortable. If love ever finds me again, I won't ask it to carry everything by itself. I'll meet it halfway, rested, aware, and whole. Because I've learned that staying isn't always brave. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is leave quietly, with respect, and finally let yourself breathe.